Today we're going to talk about how to set up a contract invoice for a supplier. So what is contract invoicing? Contract invoicing is a method of creating a contract for a supplier where you do not require a PO for the supplier to actually invoice the customer. So contract invoicing will be used for many different types of goods and services contracts. This could be based on a rate card from a contract, potentially milestones if it's project type work, or a list of services or goods. Those items are then pushed to the supplier across the Ariba network, and the supplier can actually choose the items and create an invoice to send back without a purchase order. So the benefits of using contract invoice is basically contract compliance. So because the buyer or the customer is actually defining how they want the supplier to invoice, it should reflect the actual contract in the contract workspace. So it really ensures granular contract compliance. As the supplier actually uses the Ariba network to submit the invoice, this actually means that it's a fully electronic invoice and has the efficiencies in terms of reducing purchase order errors and a seamless process where the invoice will come straight back in and will just require approval from the organization before it can be processed and paid. So contract invoicing can be used for different categories, but some common categories where this will work well is consulting, professional services, waste disposal, rent, and potentially any categories where you're not sure exactly how much the supplier will invoice on, say, a monthly basis. So hence you can't create a purchase order for those defined services. So that's the background. Now we're going to jump into Ariba. I'm going to see how easy it is to actually set up contract invoicing. So the example I'm going to step through today is waste disposal contract. So services to actually come and take bins away, skips away from an organization. We'll keep this nice and simple today. So as you can see, I'm in the contract workspace page now, and we're just looking at the overview. So I've basically gone through all the tasks and gone through the drafting process and finalized the contract. It's at this point when you can actually define what's called the contract terms, which is where you provide the detail from the contract, the items that the suppliers can then invoice against. So I'm just going to go into the Documents tab now. You should be familiar with this in terms of where you would store the physical contract, maybe the PDF and any reference documentation that was required in the drafting process of the contract. So we've actually got another document here called Contract Terms document. So this is where you actually define the invoice items. So I'm just going to open this. So the contract terms document is really the glue that joins together the contract management module and the procure to pay process. So really defines how you want the supplier to transact and make sure that you have the compliance against your contract also. The terms document it's a wizard essentially. So it steps you through the process and it's a simple document to follow and set up. So we're just in the definitions page, which is the overview of this document for this contract. As you can see, we've set the contract type as item level, and that needs to be set up in order to actually set up the invoice lines for contract invoicing. If we just move down the definitions document, we're just going to focus on release required here. So if I had selected yes, then that would mean that the supplier needs a purchase order in order to invoice. And in this case, that's not what we want to do. We want to set up invoicing against a contract. So I've selected no, which then opens up these other options to say, can the supplier invoice against the contract? Yes, because that's what we're trying to set up. The default invoice requested from the contract, that just means who will the invoice be routed to for approval. Allow suppliers to add non-catalog items. So in this case, we're going to select no, because we want to be really compliant and make sure that the items in the contract are the only items that the supplier can actually invoice against. So I'm just going to move on to the pricing terms, which is where we're going to set up the items. So as you can see, I've already set up 3 items here. So as I say, we're going to keep this simple. We've just got 3 items, one for small bin removal, one for medium bin removal, and one for large bin removal. And we've defined the price for each of those services. So what I'm going to do now is just copy one of the lines and then edit line 4. So we're just going to keep it simple and have an Excel bin removal service also for $250. Here you define the commodity code, which is going to help with your reporting. And also it's possible to set up some other more complex pricing. So you can set up limits to make sure that a minimum or maximum limit can't be exceeded. And also you can apply discounts if you have some tiered pricing, and you can define your accounting for this specific line. So I'm just going to change the part number because this needs to be unique and I haven't updated that. So I'm going to call it XL bin. And that should now be okay. Perfect. Okay, now we're just going to go to the summary. And we're going to save these contract terms. If you have many items, there is also a bulk upload process. So you can essentially populate a spreadsheet and load that in to the contract to create the contract terms items. But I've just kept it simple and done it in the actual user interface. So I'm now going to publish my contract terms document. And submit. And I've also approved the document. So once the terms document and the contract workspace is published, the supplier will then be able to access the items we've created to structure and create their invoice and send it back to the buyer. So now we're going to take a look from the supplier side. So I've logged into my Ariba Network account as the supplier. I'm simply going to go and create a contract invoice rather than a traditional PO invoice. I'm going to choose my customer, in this case Stratus Pacific. Select the business unit. Select the contract I want to invoice against. Here we go. I'm going to create an invoice number, and this process is exactly the same as a standard invoice against a PO, the header information we're applying now. I'm going to give the invoice a date, today's date. And now I'll be presented with the invoice. And this is the standard invoice screen, exactly the same as any other type of invoice a supplier would be used to entering. I'm just going to scroll to the bottom of the screen and I'm going to choose Add Items. So this now presents me with the items we've set up for this invoice. And all the supplier needs to do here, because we've defined the prices and fixed the prices for each item, is just change the quantity based on the services they've delivered. I'm just going to say 3 of the medium skip, 2 of the extra large skip. Add the items to my basket. And done. So now the invoice has applied the items for the contract invoice. I'm just going to go next. Now it's created my invoice with my 2 line items from the contract invoice. As we can see. Now I'm just going to submit that invoice. And that's done. The invoice has now been sent back to the buyer. That invoice will now be processed by the organization. And as you can see, it's a very simple process and a great buying channel contract invoicing. Thank you for listening.